Our land, our future is the campaign slogan for this year's World Environment Day. We'll discuss how global warming is impacting ecosystems and efforts to reverse the damage. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. According to the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, up to 40% of the Earth's land is degraded and directly affects half the world's population. Vital ecosystems are under threat because of severe droughts and rising temperatures. That's why on this World Environment Day, the UN is calling for a global movement to restore lands, combat drought and halt desertification. For more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Rotterdam, Netherlands is Michael Shank. He's the Director of Engagement with the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance and an adjunct professor of sustainable development at New York University. From Seattle, Yixing is the former research director at Breakthrough Energy. Also with us from Boise, Idaho, Jen Pierce is a professor with the Department of Geoscience at Boise State University, and Michael K. Dorsey is the director and chair of the Rob and Melani Walton Sustainable Solutions Service at Arizona State University. He joins us from Phoenix. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Michael Dorsey, let me start with you. World Environment Day is being marked on June 5th. The focus is on land. And those were some alarming figures that I mentioned there in the introduction. 40% of land is degraded, affecting half the world's population. And you add to that, of course, what climate scientists are telling us, and that is temperatures are rising, droughts will be more frequent. I mean, how big a crisis are the world's lands facing right now?
We're in a catastrophic crisis. It's a crisis that really is unprecedented in human history and almost planetary history. The last decade is the hottest it's been in over 125,000 years. We've seen more than 2 million tons of, or rather, it's carbon pollution, rather, is at its highest that it's been in over 2 million years. We've lost in a staggering amount of ice at the poles of the planet. We're losing about 1.2 trillion tons of ice a year because of carbon pollution and because of the unprecedented warming that we're seeing. And that 1.2 trillion tons of ice a year is hard to put our minds around. But if you divided that across the planet's population, that's like having 14 tons, 1 ton each of ice in one's home, per every individual on Earth. So the warming we're seeing is unprecedented, and it's creating planetary problems of an unprecedented historic scale.
Right, and Michael Dorsey, talking about recovery, I mean, we are degrading land at faster and faster rates, as these studies have pointed out. But there's one study, actually, which tells us that it could take up to 1,000 years to recover just 3 inches of topsoil in some parts of the planet. Can we still recover?
You know, just as much as we're facing these unprecedented climate and really environmental challenges, there is hope on the horizon. We've seen now 2 consecutive years, last year and the year before last, 23 and 21, where we've seen the overall investments in renewable energy outpace those in fossil fuels, which we know are driving the climate crisis and the other crises that we face in terms of land loss, in terms of biodiversity loss, and many other crises. So there is an upside that we can get out ahead of this, but we've got to invest in the good stuff, renewable energy, healthy technologies, clean technologies, at much faster paces. They've got to accelerate, and they are, thankfully.
Yixing, China has restored more than 6 million hectares of land. It's part of a massive drive. It's called the Shanshui Initiative. It's part of the drive to restore up to 10 million hectares by 2030. How is China doing this, and what can you tell us about this project?
Yeah, absolutely. Just as you said, this project has done over 6.7 million hectares of land, aiming for 10 million by 2030. So this initiative focuses on restoring forests, grassland, wetland, and the desert to enhance biodiversity and combat climate change. And the key achievements include significant increases in vegetation coverage, water conservation, and improvements in air quality. So this effort showcased China's commitment to ecological conservation and sustainable development. So China has been doing pretty massive and positive project in this area.
Jen Pierce, welcome to the show. Great to have you with us. Now, as the Earth heats up, weather events are becoming more and more extreme. I mean, we're hearing about that all the time. The United States, for instance, has experienced a record number of tornadoes this spring in the Midwest and the Central Plateau states. More than 500 tornadoes were experienced in May. And some of these tornadoes are rated at EF2, which means that there are winds of more than 178 kilometers per hour, or even higher in some instances. And scientists are now warning that these kind of extreme weather events could get even worse as the atmosphere heats up. Is the U.S. prepared?
The short answer is no. My main area of expertise is in wildfires. Human-caused climate change, prior studies by Botziglu and Williams and others demonstrate that human-caused climate change has caused over half of the documented increases in fuel aridity and doubled the cumulative forest fire area. So between these extreme events from tornadoes, hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, and floods, we have a lot to prepare for. What I would say is I think that it's increasingly important to focus on what we can do and not on the magnitudes of the disasters. I do a lot of outreach to K through 12 communities and schools, and so people know it's bad, even if they don't want to admit it. So focusing on what we can do, how we can better prepare our homes, for example, to increased risks from forest fires, and prepare our communities so that they are more resilient to adapt to these changes.
Right, you mentioned...
So we are making steps, but we sure have a long way to go.
Yeah, you mentioned wildfires, and there is one part of the country, California, where there have been increasing numbers of wildfires. Why is that taking place, particularly in California?
Well, there's a couple reasons. First, for our higher elevation, cooler, wetter forests, those forests typically had been too wet to burn. Now, of course, that has changed, and I always have on my climate scarf to remind people of why that is. So warmer, drier temperatures are driving large fires in these high elevation environments. But it's more complicated than that. We have also seen the increase in these catastrophic urban fires that devastate the built community and, of course, have tragically killed many people in places like Paradise, California. So those fires are driven by fuels in the built environment and can be started by a variety of mechanisms. Finally, in our lower elevation areas, rangelands, sagebrush steppe habitats, there we are seeing increased fuel loads due to invasive grasses. So there's really not a one-size-fits-all for what is driving these fires, but they certainly are increasing in a variety of ecosystems, including the urban environment.
Michael Shank, looking at the current climate situation, this is how the UN's chief on the Framework Convention on Climate Change, Simon Steele, this is how he describes it. Let's watch.
We're now heading for around 2.7 degrees. This is still ruinously high, and there's a long and steep road ahead of us to get to our shared goal of 1.5 this century. But we should be energized that we are approaching a halfway point. It's clear that the second half of humanity's climate journey will be even harder, and climate action will need to move at a much, much faster rate.
So, Michael Shank, as we are marking this World Environment Day, I mean, there are delegates from 198 countries meeting in the German city of Bonn right now to prepare for the UN Climate Change Conference, COP29, which takes place later this year. What are the goals of COP29, and realistically, what do you think can be achieved?
Simon's right. It's ruinously high, but he is energized and we are energized. I'll illuminate a few things that are being discussed at Bonn that are energizing me and are energizing our cities. So cities are more involved than ever before because the UN has rolled out a CHAMP process, and that stands for Coalition for High Ambition Multi-Level Partnerships. I mentioned it on a previous show here, and that's involving subnationals like our cities all around the world. And so they're at Bonn talking about how they're leading in many spaces, ratcheting down fossil fuels, ratcheting up renewables, leading in the food space, consumption-based emissions, et cetera, circular economy, leading in equity and justice. So all of these areas are being discussed at Bonn in the mitigation space. Now, in the adaptation space, as you can imagine, many of our coastal cities are seeing the most impacts, often disproportionately from climate change. And so loss and damage is being discussed, and climate finance is being discussed, and rich countries are being asked to pay for what they've polluted in their historical emissions, which U.S., my country, needs to do more. Certainly in that space, they've only put down 17 million for loss and damage. They need to put down closer to 2 trillion to pay for all the damages they've caused historically. So that's what's being discussed at Bonn, and I'm just thankful that our cities are more involved than ever before because they're really leading in these spaces.
Jen Pierce, I want to get your thoughts on those figures that the UN chief mentioned there. Simon Steele says, we are currently at 2.7 degrees. The goal is 1.5. And, you know, I've posed this question before. Are we rapidly getting to the point of no return right now, where it's going to be very difficult to recover?
Well, actually, I don't think that even thinking about the point of no return is productive, because when people are faced with that sort of a question, you know, oh, there's no chance, for example, that your favorite soccer team can win, then they don't do anything. So what I'd prefer to do is actually just think about all the actions we can and are taking. For example, my research group is working on solutions in the soil. How can our soils store more carbon? And how can we reward our agricultural producers for doing so? The rapid production of wind in many different nations and the lowering of the price of renewable energy, I feel is very optimistic. So I think that rather than thinking about a point of no return, I think this does mean we all need to double down and do even more than we're currently doing to address the climate crisis.
Right. Michael Dorsey, you know, a moment ago you were saying hope is on the horizon. Well, here's some hope here. There've been quite a bit of success in the transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. There was the EMBER report, which came out about a week ago, which says renewables have reduced our dependence on fossil fuels by an additional 2%. The goal, of course, is to get to zero, and they hope to get to that goal in about a decade. But how can nations now build on that?
So countries are building on this. This is a process that's underway. You know, as I said, we've had now 2 years, last year and the year before, where we've seen over $1 trillion invested in renewable energy worldwide. We've also had, and this is also historic and you know, historic for humanity, we've had the first 2 years, last year and 22, where we've seen the renewable investments outpace investments in fossil fuels. We've now have some leading fossil fuel energy companies that are beginning to invest in renewable energy and the related infrastructures in terms of storage and batteries and charging and so forth. So many countries and companies are on a path. We've got to accelerate that path and make it grow and grow. And the target trajectory for this year actually is we will probably just miss the $2 trillion mark in overall investments in renewable energy, just coming in about $1.75 trillion overall. We'll see if we inch a little bit towards that $2 trillion mark next year, which is most likely to happen.
Yixing, sure, of course, China has made enormous strides in renewable energy. It's now a world leader in things like wind technology, solar technology, as well as electric vehicles. It's also emerging as a leader in something that Michael Dorsey spoke about a moment ago, and that is the storage of energy. What can you tell us about China's efforts?
Yeah, So yeah, China is advancing very rapidly in both renewable energy and energy storage. So by the end of March this year, China has installed 35 gigawatts of new energy storage devices. This is 2 times more comparing to the previous year. So it's really fast development. And the government policies and investment in technologies like lithium ion and compressed air are quite pivotal. And energy storage is essential for integrating intermittent renewable energy resources like wind and solar into the grid and ensuring the stability and efficiency of those renewable energy resources. And China's focus on this sector is set to make it a global leader in energy storage. And China's energy storage sector is not only meeting the demand for domestic market, but also supplying the world with a very high quality and cheap low-cost energy storage equipment to help other countries to stabilize their grid as their renewable energy percentage grows. And energy storage could also help with the peak shaving, frequency regulation, faster response, and flexible dispatch. So it is really actively supporting the grid side and the operation side. So this is another huge contribution from China in the fight against the climate change.
Michael Shank, another major challenge is the availability of water. And I was looking at one report, which was in the Washington Post. It says that Mexico City, one of the biggest cities in the world, with a population of 22 million, could soon see water shortages. And when I say soon, they're talking about the end of this month. The Washington Post piece says that the city gets up to a quarter of its water from a system that is rapidly drying up. How serious is this?
It's very serious. So many cities around the world are running out of water, whether it's Sao Paulo or Cape Town or Sana, now Mexico City. These cities are seeing serious threats to their water security and their water supply. This will be an issue for forever, for the future, and will create massive displacement and migration. I'm in a city right now, Rotterdam, which is dealing with a different kind of water management issue, a different kind of water security issue, a different kind of water diplomacy issue, and they have led the world in managing their water because with warmer air, warmer moisture, we get heavier downpours, torrential rains, and so managing water, both the lack of it and the abundant amount of it that comes with torrential downpours, is the task of every city going forward. And so Rotterdam has led globally, as I mentioned, cities and countries as close as Copenhagen and as far as Singapore have come here to see how Rotterdam does it, whether it's the greening of their roofs, thousands of roofs here that are green to manage those heavy downpours, to the removal of concrete bricks and pavers and anything that's impervious so that nature-based solutions can help this water crisis, both in the lack of it, the insecurity of it, and the abundance of it with more and heavier torrential downpours. So this is very much a crisis for cities and is priority number 1 for a lot of our urban areas.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned those efforts that are being made by Rotterdam there to become what it says it wants to be, which is, it says it wants to be climate-proof by 2025. It's also, of course, a city that's very vulnerable to flooding. I mean, is that goal on track, 2025?
Yeah, so they went out early in thinking about all the impacts from sea level rise, storm surge, et cetera, including droughts to the rivers, because this is Europe's biggest port. And so the economy is dependent upon Rotterdam being climate proof in all the ways. So not only the green roofs that I mentioned, not only the removal of concrete pavers and bricks, et cetera, to make for more permeable response to those heavier downpours, but also tidal parks, taking industrial areas and creating parks out of them and playgrounds that can account for flooding when it does see those torrential downpours because the air is warmer and it's holding more moisture as a result. So cities are learning from Rotterdam's leadership in this space. And yes, according to all projections, Rotterdam's somewhat safe for the next couple decades, but we also don't know what's going to happen with climate impacts and compounding impacts. So the need for cities to buttress up and become more resilient in terms of their infrastructure is priority number 1.
Michael Dorsey, the heat dome is moving, we hear, from Mexico into the United States. We look at Phoenix in Arizona. It's seen sustained temperatures in the lower 40s Celsius. And there was a study done by Arizona University and 2 other universities which looked at how cities would fare if there is just a 3-day blackout. And Phoenix, which has a population of 800,000 people, could see 13,000 people die in this kind of extreme heat scenario. I mean, is there recognition, do you think, in the United States, and particularly in a state like Arizona, of how serious this is?
There absolutely is. There's certainly one in Arizona, where I'm based right now. There's one really across I think the U.S., but also across many countries around the world, just as Dr. Shank was saying. Right now, just this week, we're looking at roughly being about 15 to 20 degrees above average temperature in Phoenix. That's going to have huge consequences, even without the threat of a blackout. When we see things like loss of power and high excess heat, that has huge implications for those on the margins of society, the elderly, young, those that are displaced, those that have lower quality housing. We also see huge impacts for those that have resources. So this is a threat that will certainly disproportionately harm those on the margins more, but really is set up to really inconvenience and harm many, many people in this state and others that are facing these extreme temperatures and extreme catastrophic weather events.
Jen Pierce, more than half the world's population live in cities, and it's estimated that by 2050, this is an estimation made by the United Nations, that 2.5 billion people will live in cities, and cities consume 75% of the world's resources. They produce half its global waste and generate 60% of greenhouse gases. How can the cities of the future mitigate this?
That's a great question. I'd say we want to look at the low-hanging fruit. So efficiency, for example, there are great strides in building efficiency that are already on the table. These are not technologies of the future. So increasing building efficiencies, I would say, would be certainly a low-hanging fruit. I really think these other examples that, for example, Michael brought up in Rotterdam, there are cities that are leading the way in how we can create these green spaces. Michael Dorsey, referred to the folks in our warmer areas, Phoenix, for example, where we are going to see a disproportionate number of marginalized communities affected by heat, drought, flooding, all of these impacts. So we do have an opportunity to address those in cities in ways that I think can be quite creative and sustainable. Rethinking our infrastructure in terms of our transportation infrastructure in the Western United States would be a big one. Here in the Western United States, most everyone drives everywhere. How can we rethink that? How can we implement, for example, new technologies, solar on roads, to help mitigate those impacts? So we do have a long way to go. Of course, there are birth rates are falling in many of our industrialized countries, so that provides a whole another unique view of this of the future. So.
Yixing Xu, last year, 2023, China experienced record-breaking heat. In fact, Beijing saw temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius for 27 consecutive days. There was also very heavy rainfall in northeastern China. I mean, what are the expectations for this year, and how is China preparing for it?
Given these trends, the government has prioritized proactive measures to mitigate the impact of this type of extreme weather events. And one key aspect of the response involves the bolstering infrastructure resilience to withstand heat waves and floods. This includes improving urban planning to enhance drainage systems and constructing flood barriers to minimize the risk of this type of extreme events, especially in vulnerable areas. So moreover, the government is investing in advanced meteorological forecasting and early warning systems to provide timely alerts to citizens and authorities. Furthermore, public awareness campaigns and community engagement initiatives play a crucial role in enhancing resilience to extreme weather events. And also collaboration with various stakeholders, including local authorities, the scientific institutions, and community organizers is also essential for effective disaster risk management. So in summary, the expectation for this summer in China are centered around addressing the challenges posed by record-breaking heat and other type of extreme weather events. And the government response is involving comprehensive strategies, including making the infrastructure stronger and educate the public and also collaboration across the board.
Michael Shank, you know, we talk very often about the measures that various people, organizations, countries, the UN is taking to combat the impact of climate change. But if we take a broader look at this, do you think it's also time for governments to take a hard look at some of the root causes of this, some of the broader issues, like this current economic model that we have in the world right now, which calls for infinite growth? And inherent in all of that is, of course, is massive resource exploitation and the production of increasing amounts of waste. I mean, are things like that ever considered?
Thankfully, we're finally landing in this space, and I appreciate you asking the big questions here at the end of the conversation, too. You know, the things that are obvious are cars, power plants, waste. That's the obvious stuff. That's the low-hanging fruit. The harder stuff is food, fashion, family planning, buildings, embodied carbon, the stuff that people don't see as obviously connected to pollution. Now, thankfully in cities, I'll come back to cities again here because they're leading in things like circular economy and regenerative fill in the blank, regenerative ag, regenerative economies, et cetera. So we are slowly but surely introducing new models of how to consume in ways that we don't waste. We make use of every piece of the puzzle that we're producing. So thankfully, these new ideas, new languages are circulating again around circular economy, regenerative, fill in the blank, you name it. But if folks want to help out this week on World Environment Day, do get involved with your city. Do think about what you're eating, what you're wearing, what you're heating with, how you're moving, and help your city in those spaces. Because again, cities are leading. They are pledging to be carbon neutral by 2025 or net zero by 2030, or they're decarbonizing their buildings by 2030. Your city is most likely, wherever you're watching this, doing some incredible stuff, and they do need your help on World Environment Day and beyond. So there's a lot to do. And Anand, I appreciate you bringing up different models, different economic models, because the current one isn't sustainable.
Okay, and that is where we are going to have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.